April 1915. Deep beneath London, inside a smoke-filled room, lit by a single green-shaded banker's lamp, a young German financial attaché named Wilhelm Kröger stared at a document that contradicted everything Berlin believed about the war. Across the Channel, German generals had assured the Kaiser that Britain was weeks from bankruptcy, its gold reserves strained, its industry bled dry by the opening year of conflict. But the document in Kröger's trembling hands showed something impossible. Britain wasn't running out of money. It had found a hidden financial lifeline, a network of American bankers, neutral intermediaries, shadow corporations, gold syndicates, and political insiders who were funneling unprecedented sums across the Atlantic. Quietly, secretly, invisibly. As Kröger traced the routes of loans, gold shipments, and shell company transfers that kept Britain alive, a single horrifying truth took shape. The war wasn't being paid for by nations. It was being paid for by a global financial machine, one comfortable funding all sides. Act 1. The world before the Great War. In the summer of 1914, the financial world believed it understood itself. European capitals operated under a comforting delusion that wars were paid for by national treasuries, financed through gold reserves accumulated over decades, funded by the patriotic savings of citizens who bought government bonds. The gold standard, that seemingly eternal arrangement where paper currency could be exchanged for actual metal, represented not just monetary policy, but moral discipline. Governments could only spend what they possessed. Banks served their nations. Finance was a domestic affair. In Berlin, German economists looked at Britain's financial position with clinical satisfaction. Britain had entered the war with gold reserves of approximately $40 million, barely enough to fund 3 months of modern warfare. The British economy, they calculated, was hemorrhaging $5 million per day. German financial strategists predicted collapse by Christmas. "Britain cannot sustain this expenditure," read one Reichsbank memo. "Their gold will run out, their credit will evaporate, their empire will be forced to negotiate." In Paris, French officials shared similar confidence in their own position. France had spent decades building a vast network of small savers, ordinary citizens, who kept their gold in mattresses and safety deposit boxes. This reserve, scattered across millions of households, represented the nation's financial strength. When war came, these citizens would rally, purchase war bonds, fund the defense of the Republic. Finance was patriotism made tangible. And America? America was irrelevant. The United States in 1914 was viewed by European powers as an agricultural backwater, a provincial economy that exported wheat and cotton, but understood nothing of high finance. London was the world's financial capital. Paris, Berlin, and Vienna managed continental affairs. New York was a regional trading post, its banks unsophisticated, its markets shallow, its gold reserves modest compared to the ancient institutions of Europe. Wilhelm Kröger, 28 years old, had been trained in this worldview at the University of Heidelberg. He understood monetary theory, trade balances, the mechanics of central banking. He had been posted to the German embassy's financial intelligence section in neutral Copenhagen with a single mission: track British economic collapse. Calculate when London's gold would run out. Predict the moment when Britain's ability to purchase war materials would cease. For the first 6 months of war, his reports confirmed German expectations. British gold reserves were falling. The pound was under pressure. Everything was proceeding according to theory. Then the numbers stopped making sense. Act 2. The first impossible numbers. January 1915. Kröger sat in his Copenhagen office reviewing shipping manifests and bank transfer records that passed through neutral Scandinavia, one of the few remaining windows into Allied finance. Something was wrong. British gold wasn't disappearing. It was moving, but not in the direction economic theory predicted. Instead of being consumed to pay for war materials, British gold was being shipped in enormous quantities to New York. Not in desperation, but systematically, deliberately, as if Britain was making a deposit rather than a withdrawal. The numbers were staggering. In November 1914 alone, Britain had transferred $12 million in gold to New York banks. In December, another $15 million. By January, the flow had become a torrent, 20 million in a single month. Kröger checked his calculations 3 times. This made no sense. Nations at war hoarded gold. They certainly didn't ship it abroad. Yet Britain was moving its most precious monetary asset across the Atlantic at an accelerating pace. Then came the credit reports. American banks, specifically J.P. Morgan and Company and National City Bank, had begun forming syndicates, not small lending operations, but massive financial structures designed to mobilize capital on a scale Kröger had never seen. The syndicates were assembling credit facilities worth hundreds of millions of dollars for Britain, for France, for Russia. Kröger brought the figures to his superior, Ambassador von Brockdorff. "These numbers cannot be accurate," the ambassador said, scanning the report. "American banks do not have this kind of capital. This must be British propaganda, inflated figures meant to discourage us." But Kröger had verified the sources. The information came from neutral Swedish banks, Danish shipping companies, Norwegian trade houses, entities with no stake in the war's outcome. The numbers were real. In February 1915, the first major shock arrived. J.P. Morgan had extended a credit line of $50 million to the French government. Not a loan requiring immediate gold backing, but pure credit, money created through bank lending, secured only by the promise of future repayment. $50 million at 1915 exchange rates that equaled more than 10 million. 1/4 of Britain's entire pre-war gold reserve, extended in a single transaction by a private bank in a neutral country. "Wait," Kröger whispered to himself, staring at the telegram. "How is that possible?" The financial architecture of the war had shifted beneath their feet, and no one in Berlin had noticed. Acte 3. The financial machine awakes March 1915. The Morgan Bank building at 23 Wall Street became the epicenter of Allied war finance. Inside, under the direction of J.P. Morgan Jr., a financial mobilization began that dwarfed anything in modern history. The bank wasn't simply lending money. It was constructing an entirely new economic system, a transatlantic machine designed to convert American industrial capacity into Allied military power. The mechanism was elegant and devastating. First, Morgan established the British Purchasing Commission, an office that operated with unlimited authority to buy materials in the United States on behalf of Britain and its allies. The commission placed orders for steel, copper, cotton, explosives, rifles, artillery shells, barbed wire, uniforms, boots, canned food, horses, and medical supplies, every conceivable item a modern army required. But Britain couldn't pay for these orders. Its gold was already committed. Its currency was under pressure. Its economy was being transformed entirely toward war production, leaving no surplus for exports that might earn foreign exchange. So Morgan created the money. Through a series of coordinated credit agreements, American banks extended loans directly to Allied governments. Britain would place an order. Morgan would advance the credit. American manufacturers would produce the goods. The materials would be shipped across the Atlantic. And Britain would owe Morgan the money, plus interest, to be repaid after the war somehow, eventually, in theory. The scale was breathtaking. By April 1915, Morgan had organized a syndicate of 61 American banks, mobilizing over $500 million in credit. This was more than the entire circulating currency of many European nations. It represented a financial capacity that simply didn't exist in European understanding of American banking. Kröger obtained a leaked summary of Morgan's operations through a Swedish intermediary. Reading it felt like discovering a hidden continent. "They produce credit the way they produce wheat," he wrote in his diary. "Endlessly, casually, as if the supply were infinite." The document detailed purchasing contracts worth over $3 million per day, every single day, flowing through Morgan's New York office. Steel mills in Pittsburgh, munitions factories in Connecticut, textile plants in Massachusetts, copper mines in Montana, all operating at capacity, all producing for Britain, all being paid with money that hadn't existed 6 months earlier. German intelligence had calculated that American industrial output was perhaps 40% of Germany's, but these numbers suggested something impossible. American manufacturing capacity exceeded all of Europe's combined, and it was just waking up. One detail haunted Kröger. Morgan's offices operated 24 hours a day. He had obtained photographs from a neutral journalist, the building's windows glowing against the night sky, clerks working in shifts, telegraph machines clattering constantly, processing the financial paperwork of total war. It reminded him of descriptions of American factories, lit by electricity, running through the night, operating with an abundance of power that European industry reserved for emergencies. Except this was finance. Credit was being manufactured like steel, money was being created like ammunition, and all of it was flowing toward Britain. Act E4, the realization. Britain is not financing the war, May 1915. Kröger compiled his most detailed report yet, documenting the complete structure of the Morgan network. The system worked through layers of legal fiction that exploited American neutrality. Officially, the United States was not a participant in the war. President Wilson had declared American neutrality in August 1914. This meant the U.S. government couldn't directly fund the Allied war effort. But there was no law preventing private American banks from lending to foreign governments, no law preventing American companies from selling to Britain, no law restricting the movement of gold across the Atlantic. Morgan had found the gap between policy and law, and driven an entire economy through it. The mechanism operated through shell companies, hundreds of them, scattered across American cities. A purchasing agent in New York would place an order with a steel company in Pennsylvania. The steel company would fill the order, receiving payment from a Morgan credit facility. The steel would be shipped to a warehouse in New Jersey, transferred to a British freighter, and transported across the Atlantic. At every stage, the paperwork showed private commercial transactions, legal, neutral, unrestricted. But the cumulative effect was that Britain was fighting the war with American money, American materials, and American industrial capacity, while maintaining the fiction of financing itself. Kröger documented specific transactions: 67 million in steel purchases, April 1915, 45 million in copper and brass, April 1915, 23 million in explosives and chemicals, April 1915, $31 million in wheat and food supplies, April 1915. In a single month, Britain had spent $166 million in the United States. That equaled roughly $34 million, more than Britain's entire gold reserve at the start of the war. Britain was spending every month more money than it possessed, and the expenditure was accelerating. Kröger cross-referenced British government bond issuance with Morgan credit facilities. The gap was enormous. Britain was publicly raising perhaps 30% of its war expenditure through domestic bonds. The other 70% was coming from New York, from private American credit, from a financial system that operated behind closed doors, invisible to ordinary British citizens who believed their war bond purchases were funding the trenches. The emotional impact was profound. Kröger had been trained to think of finance as a zero-sum game. Wealth transferred, gold exchanged, one nation's gain being another's loss. But Morgan had revealed something different. Wealth could be created. Credit could be manufactured. The constraints that bound European finance didn't seem to apply to American banking. He wrote to his superior, We are not fighting a nation. We are fighting a bank, and the bank has more resources than we calculated possible. The shock was turning to dread. ACT-5, German intellectual collapse. Summer 1915. In Berlin, German economists were recalculating everything. The Reichsbank's models had predicted British financial exhaustion by month 8 of the war. They were now approaching month 12, and British purchasing power was increasing, not declining. Every economic indicator suggested Britain should be bankrupt, yet British orders in America were reaching record levels. Dr. Heinrich Müller, a senior economist at the German Foreign Office, reviewed Kröger's reports with growing unease. "These figures are impossible," he muttered. "Britain has spent more than 3 times its gold reserve. It should have collapsed." But Müller was thorough. He verified the numbers through independent sources, neutral Swiss banks, Danish shipping records, intercepted telegraph communications. The data was consistent, horrifyingly consistent. Britain had discovered a financial weapon Germany hadn't known existed: unlimited credit from a neutral industrial giant. The psychological impact rippled through German strategic planning. The entire war had been designed around a quick victory, before British financial superiority could mobilize. German military doctrine assumed that Britain's wealth, while greater than Germany's, was still finite. Drain it quickly, force negotiations, win the peace. But Morgan had changed the equation. British wealth wasn't being drained. It was being replenished faster than Germany could destroy it. Every shell fired at British lines was being replaced by 3 more, purchased in America, funded by credit that seemed infinite. Kröger received a confidential memo from Berlin, marked "Most Secret." "Your reports suggest that American banks are lending sums that exceed American gold reserves by a factor of 5. This violates every principle of sound banking. Either your figures are wrong, or the American financial system operates on principles we do not understand. Clarify immediately." Kröger replied with a detailed explanation of fractional reserve banking, credit multiplication, and the Federal Reserve System, created just months before the war. Began. American banks didn't lend gold. They created deposits. They manufactured credit through accounting. They could expand the money supply almost without limit, constrained only by their willingness to accept risk. And Morgan was willing to accept enormous risk, because Morgan knew Britain would win. The loans weren't gambles. They were investments in the continuation of British power, backed by the implicit understanding that an Allied victory would guarantee repayment. The German strategic position was collapsing, and the collapse was happening in banks and counting houses, far from any battlefield. AC6, the public remains in the dark. While German economists grappled with these revelations, ordinary people on all sides remained completely unaware of the financial machinery funding the war. In Britain, citizens queued to purchase war bonds, small denominations of $5 or $10, convinced their patriotic savings were arming the troops. Propaganda posters showed British soldiers depending on domestic support. "Your bond brings victory," read the banners. The narrative was clear. Britain was financing its own defense through the collective sacrifice of its people. The truth was more complicated. British war bond drives raised approximately $1.3 billion during the war's first 2 years. In that same period, British war expenditure exceeded $4 billion. The gap, nearly $3 billion, came from American credit, Morgan loans, private bank financing that most British citizens never heard about. In France, the situation was identical. French war bonds were celebrated as expressions of national unity. In reality, French expenditure was running at nearly twice the rate of bond revenue. The difference was made up through American loans, coordinated through Morgan's Paris office. The financial elite moved in shadows. In New York, Morgan executives met with British Treasury officials in private clubs, negotiating credit lines worth more than most nations' annual budgets. These meetings were never reported. The contracts were confidential. The public saw only the surface, British fortitude, French determination, American neutrality. Kröger documented this gap between public narrative and financial reality in a report titled The Hidden War. He wrote, "The common soldier believes he fights for his nation. The factory worker believes his labor supports his country's cause. But the money that pays for the bullets, the shells, the rifles, the ships, this money comes from a private banking network that serves no flag. It serves profit. It serves the perpetuation of debt. It serves itself." The irony was bitter. While European families sacrificed, rationed, endured deprivation, the financiers who truly controlled the war's continuation operated in comfort, earning interest on loans that would take generations to repay. One anecdote particularly struck Kröger. In August 1915, a British ship captain transported $5 million in gold from Liverpool to New York. The gold was placed in Morgan's vault, collateral for another massive loan. The ship captain was paid 200 tolons for his trouble. Morgan's commission on the loan was 750,000 tolons. The war, Kröger realized, had created the greatest wealth transfer in history, from European governments to American banks, and the public had no idea. Act 7. The network reveals its power. By autumn 1915, the Morgan network had evolved from financial facilitator to strategic controller. The power was subtle but absolute. Britain no longer simply bought what it wanted in America. It bought what Morgan's network could supply. American manufacturers prioritized orders that flowed through Morgan-approved channels. Shipping was allocated according to Morgan's coordination. Even Allied military strategy began to reflect the availability of American credit. Offensives were timed to match loan disbursements, strategic planning, adjusted to ensure continued American financial support. The relationship had become dependency. Lord Reading, the British official who negotiated with Morgan in New York, wrote in a confidential letter, "We are now in a position where American goodwill is more critical to our war effort than the strength of the Royal Navy. If Morgan were to cease lending, we would be forced to seek terms within weeks." This was the nightmare scenario German strategists had originally predicted: British financial exhaustion. Except the exhaustion didn't force Britain to negotiate with Germany. It forced Britain to accept American terms. The loans came with conditions. Morgan required oversight of British purchasing. Morgan demanded regular financial reports. Morgan insisted on influence over British monetary policy. The relationship between creditor and debtor was becoming the relationship between patron and client, and Morgan was positioning itself to profit regardless of outcome. Through neutral Swiss intermediaries, Kröger discovered that Morgan-affiliated banks were also quietly extending credit to German companies, smaller amounts, carefully structured to avoid direct war financing, but enough to maintain relationships. The financial elite were hedging. If Germany somehow won, Morgan would be owed money. If Britain won, Morgan would be owed vastly more money. Either way, Morgan won. This realization was perhaps the most psychologically devastating for Kröger. The war wasn't a conflict between ideologies or civilizations. It was a business opportunity, being managed by financiers who viewed nations as customers and carnage as overhead expense. He wrote in his diary, October 1915, "We believed we were fighting for German greatness. They believed they were fighting for British honor. But the men who truly control this war believe in nothing except the ledger book, and they are winning." Actui 8. The war ends, but the network does not. November 1918. The guns fell silent. The treaties were signed. Empires collapsed. Millions were dead. But the financial network that funded the war didn't dissolve. It transformed. By the armistice, Allied governments owed American banks over $10 billion, a sum so vast it exceeded the entire economic output of most nations. Britain alone owed $4.7 billion, France owed $3.4 billion, Russia, now in revolutionary chaos, owed $192 million that would never be repaid. Italy owed $1.6 billion. These weren't debts that could be easily settled. They represented obligations that would structure international relations for decades. The United States had entered the war as a debtor nation, owing money to European banks. It emerged as the world's primary creditor, with European powers financially subordinate to American banking interests. The gold that Britain had shipped to New York in 1914 never returned. It became the foundation of American financial dominance. The Federal Reserve, created just before the war, used this gold to back an expansion of dollar-denominated credit that would eventually replace the pound sterling as the world's reserve currency. The Morgan network, which had operated as a temporary wartime expedient, became permanent infrastructure. J.P. Morgan and Company remained the primary intermediary for European government financing. American banks became the essential partners for any major European industrial project. The Atlantic Financial Corridor, once a secret wartime channel, became the central axis of the global economy. Kröger, who survived the war and briefly worked in the Weimar Republic's finance ministry, watched this transformation with grim recognition. The new monetary order looked exactly like the wartime system, except now it was official, public, unchallengeable. The Treaty of Versailles, which formally ended the war, was as much a financial document as a political one. Germany was required to pay reparations of 132 billion gold marks, a sum so enormous it would require generations to pay. But German reparations would flow through American banks, who would collect fees on every transaction. The peace was structured to ensure the financial network's perpetuation. Kröger wrote in his final report, dated December 1919, "We lost the war in 1918, but the war was lost in 1915 in a New York bank office when we failed to understand that modern conflict is not won by armies. It is won by those who control the creation of money. We fought soldiers while they manufactured credit. We could never have won." Act 9. Final Revelation. The Great War fundamentally transformed how wars are financed, how power is structured, and who controls the machinery of conflict. Before 1914, wars were paid for through taxation and gold reserves, mechanisms that created natural limits on duration and intensity. After 1918, wars would be financed through credit creation, deficit spending, and international loans that pushed costs into the future. The Morgan network revealed a troubling truth. Modern wars are not fought until one side exhausts its resources. They are fought until one side exhausts its credit. And credit is not a natural resource. It is manufactured by banks, extended at interest, and controlled by a relatively small number of financial institutions that operate across borders. The ordinary soldiers who died at the Somme, at Verdun, at Gallipoli, they believed they were dying for their nations. They were. But their nations were fighting with borrowed money, controlled by bankers who profited from the prolongation of conflict. Every month the war continued, interest accumulated. Every offensive, every failed attack, every bloody stalemate, it all translated into larger debts, greater obligations, more power transferred from governments to financial institutions. This system did not end with the Great War. It became the template. World War II would be financed through an even more sophisticated system of loans, bonds, and credit creation. The Cold War was fundamentally a competition of which bloc could sustain greater debt. Modern conflicts are fought by nations that spend money they don't have, borrowed from institutions that profit from instability. Wilhelm Kröger died in 1947, having watched 2 world wars and their aftermaths. Shortly before his death, he gave an interview to a German economic journal. Asked what he had learned from his time tracking Allied finances during the Great War, he replied, "I learned that governments do not control banks. banks control governments. I learned that wars are not won by the side with greater courage or better strategy. Wars are won by the side with better access to credit. And I learned that the public is never told the truth about who is really paying for war, because if they knew, they might refuse to fight. The Great War ended on the battlefield in November 1918. But the financial system it created, the network of international credit, the dominance of American banking, the subordination of national policy to financial interests, that system never surrendered. It simply evolved, matured, and became the foundation of the modern world. The war to end all wars created the financial architecture that would make all future wars possible. And most people still don't know it exists.